today we're talking about leases. If you're considering leasing a rental space or renewing your lease, listen in to today. We're going to have some key tips that enable you to negotiate your lease like a pro. Learn about more common mistakes that retailers make during lease negotiations and how to gauge if you're getting a fair deal. Kia ora, I'm Carolyn Young, Chief Executive at Retail NZ. Today I'm joined by Todd, who's an associate with Ford Sumner Lawyers, who are partners at Retail NZ. Welcome, Jordan.
Kia ora, Carolyn. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, look, our pleasure. I guess let's get straight into it. It's a really interesting topic, talking about leases, and something that every retailer is grappling with. And I guess if we think about that, what's the first thing a retailer should do when they start thinking about negotiating a new lease, or if they're renewing their current one?
So starting with a new lease scenario, before you even get to the terms of your lease, actually take a step back and carry out a due diligence investigation on, first of all, the location of the premises that you're looking to lease. So first and foremost, can you actually conduct your business from the space that you're looking to lease? It's an often overlooked consideration in our experience, but it's important to realise that probably 99% of commercial leases that we see contain a clause to the effect that the landlord doesn't provide any warranty as to the suitability of the premises for the tenant's intended use. So what that means is effectively the tenant takes on the risk of there being any inability on the tenant's part to actually set up a retail business, as the case may be in the particular space. So make sure you're getting in touch with council if need be and checking whether or not you need a resource consent. And then obviously practically, what's the locality like? Is there a lot of foot traffic? If you've got a brick and mortar retail store, you're going to be relying on that. If you're looking to lease a retail complex where there are maybe already one or two quite big players there, check and see whether their long-term sort of aspirations are to remain in their premises or whether they might be leaving soon, in which case that might affect the sort of volume of foot traffic in that particular space. Is there any construction planned for the area that might detract people from coming into your shop? And then turning to the building, does it require any obvious repair or maintenance work? This one's more of a consideration for Wellington and Christchurch, but what's its earthquake rating? If it's an earthquake-prone building, then obviously that creates bigger risk, and as an employer it creates sort of health and safety considerations. So make sure you're getting an engineering report if there's one available from the landlord or its agent. So even before you get into the lease terms and negotiating those, just obviously make sure that you're carrying out a thorough investigation, because you can always negotiate the lease terms. You can't negotiate the whereabouts of the property. In terms of renewals, make sure you're diarising the date that you need to advise of your desire to renew the lease by. So often leases will require the tenant to give at least 3 months written notice if they want to renew their lease, although don't rely on that common practice, because sometimes it's a longer period, so 4 or 6 months, for example. So make sure you don't miss that deadline. The other important reason to diarise and get all your ducks in a row when it comes to renewals is that you may very well want to have a discussion with the landlord around renewal time as to any variations to the lease. So whether you'd like the landlord to carry out any repair or maintenance work, whether you'd like to adjust the length of the renewed term of the lease, or whether you'd like to ask for a rent-free period in consideration of you deciding to renew. All things that you should get onto early enough so that you can have time to have those discussions with the landlord and then make an informed decision as to whether or not you want to renew your lease.
Look, they're really, really important things to think about, aren't they? And critical to the success of a retailer running their businesses. The location, the proximity of other businesses, the foot traffic, the safety of the building. Is it yellow stickered or red stickered in Wellington, or Christchurch or in other areas? What other roadworks might be happening or building changes might be happening. There's been lots of those sorts of things in Dunedin and Christchurch, Wellington, Tauranga, Auckland, and they all have an impact on a business's viability to be able to stay open. So really good advice. And I guess the simple thing is due diligence and preparation before you just sign on the dotted line, right?
Absolutely, yep.
So what would be the common mistakes that you'd see retailers make during lease negotiations that could, easily be avoided?
I think, and it's particularly something we see with perhaps smaller sized tenants, they often fail to appreciate that they actually have quite a bit of leverage in the negotiation process. So, often, and we work for quite a lot of landlords as well, it's not necessarily the case that the landlord has, a line of potential tenants waiting to lease their space. So when a tenant is presented with lease terms, and obviously that will usually come from the landlord or its agent in the first instance, it's important to remember that it is a negotiation. So it's usually not a case of, here are the terms that I'm prepared to offer you a lease of this space on, take it or leave it. You do have some leverage and an ability to negotiate terms as a tenant, whether that's, again, term length, if you're not comfortable, especially if you're a new business owner, taking on a 5+ year lease, which is a big financial commitment in most cases, then ask for a shorter term and perhaps supplement that with rights of renewal, so you can make a decision as the tenant, provided you're not in breach of the lease, whether or not you carry on and lease the space for further terms. And again, things like rent-free periods, it's kind of a case of if you don't ask, you don't get. So feel free, and particularly rent-free periods are based on the length of lease term that you take up. It's relatively commonplace for landlords to, at the very least, consider granting a rent-free period in consideration of you taking up a lease of the space. So I think it's really important, sort of against that background, for retailers and tenants in general to engage their professional advisors early on, because you've got to often take a team approach when it comes to taking on a commitment as significant as a multi-year lease. So your professional advisors, your accountant, your lawyer, your insurance broker, in many cases, they're going to be really well placed to advise you, and when it comes to things like to rent and obviously, the terms of the lease. So that would be the real key piece of advice, is getting professional advisors involved early, and not DIYing the process, which obviously there's a huge desire to do in a lot of cases, but it can be a bit of a false economy when you're saying, well, I don't want to spend too much up front, but you get sort of laden with really adverse lease terms that you're kind of stuck with over the course of the lease. So one common mistake we often see is we have clients come to us and they've already signed an agreement to lease, and they've asked us to either draft or review the deed of lease. And what they don't often appreciate is that the deed of lease typically needs to reflect the terms of the agreement to lease. So if we haven't been engaged early enough and we're sort of presented with a deed of lease that has a lot of issues with it, at least from our client's perspective, we're often constrained in terms of how much we can, go back to the drawing board or the negotiation table and try and mitigate some of those issues. So it really goes back to getting in touch with your professional advisors, whether it's your lawyer, your accountant. If you have a relationship with a commercial agent, then by all means reach out to them, and in terms of getting advice on the reasonableness of the proposed rent, and get them involved early and spend a bit of money up front, but often that will result in a lot of savings over the long term.
And I think the key point that you've mentioned there is that actually that a lot of small retailers don't realise it is a negotiation, and that they do have the ability to negotiate, and they do have as much power as what the landlord does. And if they don't get the terms they want, then they don't have to sign up. There's always another property that they could get. So I think, once again, goes back to the planning and actually having confidence that you can still negotiate the terms that the landlord has presented to you. So really great advice. But I guess if we think from a retailer perspective, how could they gauge if they're getting a fair deal when it comes to rent or other lease terms? What would they be looking at?
Yeah, it's difficult, particularly if, again, you're perhaps a smaller operator and you haven't really dealt with a commercial lease negotiation before. Kind of sounds like I'm banging the drum a wee bit, but it really is important to rely on the people around you who, have dealt with these sort of issues, whether it's day in and day out or just more than you might have. So, again, if we're presented with a lease, we're more than likely going to be better placed than our client to identify any real key areas of risk for them. And the same with, your insurance broker. If there's a really curly insurance clause in there that, might not gel with whatever insurance policies you have in place, then it's, really important that they have an opportunity to review that as well and advise you, because at the end of the day, like I say, you don't want to be laden with something that's, going to be possibly fatal for your business over the term of the lease. So, going back to your question, obviously your lawyer, your accountant, your broker, they're all going to be vital in the leasing process for you. How can you assess whether the rent, which is obviously, in most cases, the most important commercial term of the lease. How can you assess whether the proposed rent is reasonable? Key things we ask for when we're acting for tenants is a copy of the valuation report that the landlord hopefully has received that underpins the proposed rent. And those valuation reports often set out similar rentals for comparable premises in the area, so you can sort of benchmark whether the proposed rent is a market rent. If the landlord hasn't got a valuation report to support their rental proposal, that's fine, but sort of directs the conversation towards, well, on what basis has this rent been arrived at? And that's where it might be a good idea for you to get in touch with a local agent who specialises in commercial properties, and basically just pick their brain and ask them whether the rent that's been proposed for the space that you're looking at is sort of within the realm of the market rent for that space. And you'd be surprised how receptive agents are to those sort of calls, even if you don't know them beforehand, because the agent will know that if you ever want to sublease or assign that premises down the track, then if there's an established relationship between you and them, then you're more than likely going to get in contact with them and get them to assist when the time comes for that as well. So again, it's all about, not trying to DIY things and just getting in touch with, people who can sort of supplement your knowledge around the sort of early leasing stage.
Really great advice. And I guess just to finish up, when we think about lease agreements and how important is it to develop a good relationship with your landlord? And would you be developing a relationship with the property manager and the landlord, or just with one, or just with the property manager if they were assigned duties to a property manager rather than the landlord themselves directly?
Yep, it's hugely important to have a good relationship with your landlord, whether that's through a property manager that they may have engaged to take care of their property portfolio if they're a bigger landlord, in which case you may not be dealing with the actual landlord on a day-to-day basis. But equally, if there is an opportunity for you to meet them, then by all means, there's nothing like a face-to-face meeting to put a face to a name and really build that rapport from the get-go. I suppose it's not really too dissimilar to the type of relationship you want to build with your suppliers or your customers or your employees. I mean, there's that intangible benefit to having good relationships with people, and your landlord or their agent or property manager, as the case may be, is no different. I suppose I think back to 2020 and COVID, when we're dealing with the lockdowns and the sort of rental concession agreements that almost came out of nowhere. We invariably found that it was easier to assist in coming to agreements on rental concessions for clients that had good relationships with their landlord or their tenant, as opposed to those who maybe didn't have a strong connection or for whatever reason didn't have the best of relationships, and it just sort of protracted the negotiations and stopped clients in those cases from actually just getting on and focusing on keeping their business going and looking after their people. So having a good relationship with your landlord, whether that's directly with them or with a property manager, for example, is important, not just in terms of getting the initial lease negotiations over the line, but in terms of further negotiations that will invariably arise throughout the entire leasing relationship.
Yeah. Good advice. And look, I thank you so much for joining us today, Jordan. I think the key thing that I've learned from today was, one, about actually doing your preparation, being a Girl Guide or a Boy Scout, prepare. And then secondly, trust the experts. When you think about yourselves as a retailer, you're an expert, whether it's in fashion or in leisure wear or in groceries or whatever you're an expert in, you would expect people to come to you to ask for expert advice. Make sure you go to the experts when you need advice about such big decisions about leasing a premise. Thank you so much, Jordan, for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you. Jordan's an associate with Ford Sumner Lawyers, who are a partner of Retail NZ. And that partnership means that you, as retailers, get a 10% discount through Ford Sumner when you come via our advice line. We can refer you through and get all of that great advice directly from Ford Sumner. So thanks, Jordan, for joining me. It's been great having a chat today.
Thanks, Carolyn. Brilliant to join you.
And look, I hope everyone has enjoyed this episode, and please check out the links for further information below. Today was part of our Empowering Retail series, your go-to resource for short, actionable insights designed to take your retail business to the next level. Watch out for other episodes and don't forget to subscribe. Ta kētia anō, bye for now. Kia ora.